Hello children, I'm going to continue the wonderful story by Hans Christian Andersen of The Little Mermaid. This is part 2. I'll just read the last few words from the part 1. His limbs were failing him. His beautiful eyes were closed, and he would certainly have drowned if the little mermaid had not come to his rescue. She held his head above water and then let the waves carry her along with him. By morning the storm had died down and there was not a trace of the ship. The sun rose red and glowing up out of the water and seemed to bring colour back into the prince's cheeks, but his eyes remained closed. The mermaid kissed his fine high forehead and smoothed back his wet hair. He seemed to her like the marble statue in her little garden. She kissed him again and made a wish that he might live. Soon the mermaid saw the mainland before her, with its lofty blue mountains covered with glittering white snow that looked like nestling swans. Near the coast were lovely green forests, and close by was a large building. Whether it was a church or a convent, she could not say. Lemon and orange trees were growing in the garden, and at the door there were tall palm trees. The sea formed a small bay at this point, and the water in it was quite still, though very deep. The mermaid swam with the handsome prince to the beach, which was covered with fine white sand. There she placed him in the warm sunshine, making a pillow for his head with the sand. Bells sounded in the large white building, and a number of young girls came through the garden. The little mermaid swam farther out from the shore, hiding behind some large boulders that rose out of the water. She covered her hair and chest with sea foam so that no one could see her. Then she watched to see who would come to help the poor prince. Not much later a young girl came along. She seemed quite frightened, but only for a moment, and ran to get help from others. The mermaid saw the prince come back to life, and he smiled at everyone around him. But there was no smile for her, because he had no idea that she had rescued him. After he was taken away to the large building, she felt so miserable that she dove into the water and returned to her father's palace. She had always been silent and thoughtful, but now more so than ever. Her sisters asked her what she had seen during her first visit to the surface, but she told them nothing. Many a morning and many an evening she rose up to the spot where she had left the prince. She saw the fruits in the garden ripen and watched as they were harvested. She saw the snow melt on the peaks, but she never saw the prince, and so she always returned home, filled with even greater sorrow than before. Her one comfort was sitting in her little garden, with her arms around the beautiful marble statue, which was so like the prince. She gave up tending her flowers, and they grew into a kind of wilderness out over the paths, twining their long stalks and leaves around the branches of the trees until the light was quite shut out. At length she could keep it to herself no longer and told one of her sisters everything. The others learned about it soon afterwards, but no one else, except a few other mermaids who didn't breathe a word to anyone but their best friends. One of them was able to give her news about the prince. She too had seen the festival held on board and told more about the prince and the location of his kingdom. "Come, little sister," said the other princesses, and with their arms on each other's shoulders, they rose in one long row to the surface, just in front of where the prince's castle stood. The castle was built of a pale yellow shining stone, and it had long flights of marble steps, one of which led straight down to the sea. Splendid gilded domes rose above the roof, and between the pillars that surrounded the entire building were lifelike sculptures in marble. Through the clear glass of the tall windows, you could see magnificent rooms hung with sumptuous silk curtains and tapestries. The walls were covered with large paintings that were a pleasure to contemplate. In the centre of the largest room was a fountain that threw its sparkling jets high up to the glass dome of the ceiling, through which the sun shone down on the water and on the beautiful plants growing in the large pool. Now that the little mermaid knew where the prince lived, she spent many an evening and many a night at that spot. She swam much closer to the shore than any of the others dared. She even went up the narrow channel to reach the fine marble balcony that threw its long shadow across the water. Here she would sit and gaze at the young prince, who thought that he was completely alone in the bright moonlight. Often in the evening, the little mermaid saw him go out to the sea in his splendid vessel, with flags hoisted to the strains of music. She peeked out from among the green rushes, and when the wind caught her long silvery white veil and the people saw it, they just fancied it was a swan spreading its wings. On many nights, when the fishermen were out at sea with their torches, she heard them praising the young prince, and their words made her even happier that she had saved his life that day. He was drifting about half dead on the waves, and she remembered how she had cradled his head on her chest, and how lovingly she had kissed him. But he knew nothing about any of this, and never even dreamed she existed. The little mermaid grew more and more fond of human beings, and longed deeply for their company. Their world seemed so much larger than her own. You see, they could fly across the ocean in ships, and climb the steep mountains high above the clouds, and the lands they possessed, their woods and their fields, stretched far beyond where she could see. There was so much that she would have liked to know, and her sisters weren't able to answer all her questions. And so she went to visit her old grandmother, who knew all about the upper world, as she so aptly called the countries above the sea. Oh, yes, yes, replied the old woman. They too must die, and their lifetime is even shorter than ours. We sometimes live to the age of 300, but when our life here comes to an end, we merely turn into foam on the water. We don't even have a grave down here among those we love. We lack an immortal soul, and we shall never have another life. We're like the green rush. Once it's been cut, it stops growing. But human beings have souls that live forever, even after their bodies have turned to dust. They rise up through the pure air until they reach the shining stars, just as we come up out of the water and survey the lands of human beings. So they rise up to beautiful, unknown realms, regions we shall never see. Why can't we have an immortal soul? Little Mermaid asked mournfully. I would gladly give all 300 years I have to live to become a human being for just one day and to share in that heavenly world. You mustn't go worrying about that, said Grandmother. We're much happier and better off than the human beings who live up there. Oh, so then I'm doomed to die and float like foam on the sea, never to hear the music of the waves or see the lovely flowers and the red sun. Isn't there anything at all I can do to win an immortal soul? No, said the old woman. Only if a human loved you so much that you meant more to him than father and mother, if he were to love you with all his heart and soul, and let the priest place his right hand in yours as a promise to be faithful and true here and in all eternity, then his soul would glide into your body, and you too would obtain a share of human happiness. He would give you a soul and yet keep his own. But that can never happen. Your fishtail, which we find so beautiful, looks repulsive to people on earth. They know so little about it that they really believe the two clumsy supports they call legs look nice. The little mermaid sighed and looked mournfully at her fishtail. We must be satisfied with what we have, said the old woman. Let's dance and be joyful for the 300 years we have to live. That's really quite time enough. After that we'll rest all the better and get our fill of sleep after we die. Tonight we are going to have a court ball. That was something more splendid than anything we ever see on earth. The walls and ceiling of the great ballroom were made of thick but transparent crystal. Several hundred enormous shells, rose red and grass green, were ranged on either side, each with a blue flame that lit up the entire room, and by shining through the walls also lit up the sea. Countless fish, large and small, could be seen swimming toward the crystal walls. The scales on some of them glowed with a purple-red brilliance, and on others like silver and gold. Through the middle of the ballroom flowed a broad stream, and in it mermen and mermaids were dancing to their own sweet song. No human beings have voices so lovely. The little mermaid sang more sweetly than anyone else, and everyone applauded her. For a moment there was joy in her heart, for she knew that she had the most beautiful voice of anyone on land or in the sea. But then her thoughts turned to the world above her. She was unable to forget the handsome prince and her great sorrow that she lacked the immortal soul he had. So she crept out of her father's palace, and while everyone inside was singing and making merry, she sat grieving in her own little garden. Suddenly she caught the sound of a horn echoing through the water, and she thought, there he is sailing above, he whom I love more than my father or my mother, he who is always in my thoughts, in whose hands I would gladly place my happiness. I would venture anything to win him and an immortal soul. While my sisters are dancing away in father's castle, I will go to the sea witch. I've always been dreadfully afraid of her, but perhaps she can help me and tell me what to do. And so the little mermaid left her garden and set off for the place where the witch lived, on the far side of the foaming whirlpools. She had never been over there before. There were no flowers growing there, and no sea grass. There was nothing but the bare, grey, sandy bottom, stretching right up to the whirlpools, where the water went swirling around like roaring mill wheels and pulled everything that it could get down with it to the depths. She had to pass through the middle of those churning eddies in order to get to the domain of the sea witch. For a long stretch there was no other way than over hot bubbling mud. The witch called it her swamp. The witch's house lay behind the swamp, in the middle of a fantastic forest. All the trees and bushes were polyps, half animal and half plant. They looked like 100-headed serpents growing out of the ground. They had branches that looked like long, slimy arms with supple worm-like fingers, joint by joint, from the root up to the very tip. They were constantly on the move, and they wound themselves tightly around anything they could seize from the sea, never letting go. The little mermaid was terrified and paused at the edge of the wood. Her heart was throbbing with fear, and she was close to turning back. Then she remembered the prince and the human soul, and her courage returned. She fastened her long flowing hair tightly around her head so that polyps couldn't grab it. Then she folded her arms across her chest and darted forward like a fish shooting through the water, in among the hideous polyps which reached out for her with their agile arms and fingers. She noticed how each of them had caught something and held it fast with 100 little arms that were like hoops of iron. The white skeletons of humans who had perished at sea and sunk down into the deep waters looked out from the arms of the polyps. Ship rudders and chests were gripped tight in their arms, along with the skeletons of land animals, and, most horrifying of all, a small mermaid whom they had caught and strangled. Now she came to a large slimy marsh in the wood, where big fat water snakes were rolling in the mire, showing their hideous whitish yellow bellies. In the middle of the marsh stood a house built with the bones of shipwrecked human folk. There sat the sea witch, letting a toad feed from her mouth, just the way people sometimes feed a canary with a piece of sugar. She called the hideous water snakes her little chicks and let them crawl over her chest. "I know exactly what you're after," said the sea witch. "How stupid of you! But you shall have your way, and it will bring you misfortune, my pretty princess. You want to get rid of your fishtail, and in its place have a couple of stumps to walk on like a human being, so that the young prince will fall in love with you, and you can win an immortal soul." And with that, the witch let out such a loud, repulsive laugh that the toad and the snakes fell and went sprawling on the ground. "You've come at just the right time," said the witch. "Tomorrow, once the sun is up, I wouldn't be able to help you for another year. I shall prepare a drink for you. You will have to swim to land with it before sunrise. Sit down on the shore and swallow it. Your tail will then divide in two and shrink into what human beings call pretty legs. But it will hurt. It will feel like a sharp sword passing through you,
All who see you will say that you are the loveliest little human being they have ever seen. You will keep your graceful movements. No dancer will ever glide so lightly. But every step taken will make you feel as if you were treading on a sharp knife, enough to make your feet bleed. If you are prepared to endure all that, I can help you."
"Yes," said the little mermaid. Her voice trembled, but she turned her thoughts to the prince and the prize of an immortal soul.
"Think about it carefully," said the witch. "Once you take on the form of a human, you can never again be a mermaid. You won't be able to swim down through the water to your sisters and to your father's palace. The only way you can get an immortal soul is to win the prince's love and make him willing to forget his father and mother for your sake. He must have you always in his thoughts, and allow the priest to join your hands to become man and wife. If the prince marries someone else, the morning thereafter your heart will break, and you will become foam on the crest of the waves."
"I'm ready," said the little mermaid, and she turned pale as death.
"But you will have to pay me," said the witch. "And you're not getting my help for nothing. You have the loveliest voice of anyone who dwells down here at the bottom of the sea. You probably think that you can charm the prince with that voice, but you will have to give it to me. I'm going to demand the best thing you possess as the price for my potion. You see, I have to mix in some of my own blood so that the drink will be as sharp as a double-edged sword."
"But if you take away my voice," said the little mermaid, "what will I have left?"
"Your lovely figure," said the witch, "your graceful movements and your expressive eyes. With those you can easily enchant a human heart. Well, where's your courage? Put out your little tongue and let me cut it off as my payment. Then you shall have your powerful potion."
"So be it," said the little mermaid, and the witch placed her cauldron on the fire to brew the potion. We'll stop there. We'll have another part in a minute.